The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the sprawling Thornfield ranch, casting long shadows across the dusty Arizona Territory landscape. Marcus Thornfield stood on his porch, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he surveyed his domain with growing frustration. At 52, the cattle baron had built his empire from nothing, but now that empire seemed to be slipping through his fingers like desert sand. "Boss, we lost another 20 head last night," called out Jake Morrison, his foreman, as he approached the house with his hat in his hands. The man's face bore the grim expression that had become all too familiar over the past month. Marcus's jaw tightened. "That makes 80 cattle gone in 3 weeks. 80 head of prime beef vanished without a trace." He turned to face Jake, his steel-gray eyes blazing with anger. "What do you mean, vanished? Cattle don't just disappear into thin air." Jake shifted uncomfortably, wiping sweat from his brow with a dusty bandana. "That's just it, Mr. Thornfield. There ain't no trail to follow, no hoof prints leading away, no broken fences, nothing. It's like they just walked into the desert and disappeared." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. A group of cowboys rode into the yard, their mounts lathered with sweat and their faces etched with defeat. Leading them was Tom Bradley, one of Marcus's most experienced hands, a man who'd been tracking rustlers for over 20 years. "Any luck, Tom?" Marcus called out, though the answer was written plainly across the cowboy's sun-weathered face. Tom dismounted heavily, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the packed earth. "Nothing, boss. We rode out to Devil's Canyon like you said, checked every cave, every hiding spot we could think of, found some old Apache signs but nothing fresh, no cattle, no rustlers, no answers." Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger building in his chest. "Apache signs, I knew it. Those savages have been picking off my herd piece by piece. They think they can steal from me and hide in their mountain strongholds?" "Now hold on, Mr. Thornfield," Tom said carefully, his voice measured. "Those signs were old, maybe weeks old, and respectfully, sir, the Apache around these parts, they ain't been raiding much lately. Chief Naich's band has been keeping to the reservation mostly." "Don't tell me what the Apache have and haven't been doing," Marcus snapped. "I've lost nearly 100 head of cattle and somebody's responsible. If it's not rustlers, and my own men can't find hide nor hair of my stock, then it has to be the Indians." Jake cleared his throat nervously. "Boss, we've had 30 of the best cowboys in the territory searching for 3 weeks. If there was a trail to follow, we'd have found it by now." Marcus began pacing the length of his porch, his boots creating a rhythmic thudding against the wooden planks. The sound echoed across the yard like a countdown to some inevitable confrontation. 30 men, he muttered. 30 experienced cowboys, and not one of you can tell me where my cattle have gone. The assembled cowboys exchanged uncomfortable glances. These were hardened men, skilled in their craft, proud of their abilities. To admit defeat went against everything they stood for, but the evidence was undeniable. They were stumped. "Mr. Thornfield," Tom ventured, "maybe we're looking at this all wrong. Maybe it ain't rustlers at all. Could be something else entirely." "Like what?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. Tom removed his hat and ran his fingers through his grey hair. "Well, sir, there's been talk in town about strange things happening. Folks saying they've seen lights in the desert at night, heard sounds that don't make sense." "Lights? Sounds?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Tom Bradley, I didn't hire you to chase ghost stories. I hired you to protect my cattle and find out who's stealing them." The tension in the yard was palpable. The other cowboys remained silent, knowing better than to interrupt when their boss was in one of his moods. They'd all heard the strange stories Tom mentioned, but none dared voice their thoughts aloud. Marcus stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on the distant mountains, where Apache territory began. "I'm giving you men 1 more week, 1 week to find my cattle or find out what happened to them. If you can't do that, then I'll take matters into my own hands." "What do you mean, boss?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I mean, I'll ride into Apache territory myself and get some answers, even if I have to shake them out of Chief Naich personally." The cowboys shifted uneasily. They all knew such an action could spark the kind of violence that had plagued the territory for decades. Relations between the white settlers and the Apache had been relatively peaceful lately, and most sensible men wanted to keep it that way. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter but more intense shadows, Marcus Thornfield stood like a man on the edge of a precipice. His empire, built through years of hard work and determination, seemed to be crumbling beneath his feet. The mystery of the vanishing cattle gnawed at him like a persistent wound, and his patience was running dangerously thin. Unknown to Marcus and his men, their salvation would come from the most unexpected source: and it would challenge everything they thought they knew about the land they called home. 3 days had passed since Marcus Thornfield's ultimatum, and the situation had only grown worse. Another 15 head of cattle had vanished during the night, taken from a pasture that 4 cowboys had been guarding in shifts. The men swore they'd heard nothing, seen nothing. The cattle were simply gone when morning came. The town of Copper Ridge buzzed with nervous energy as word of the continuing thefts spread. In the dusty saloon, concerned ranchers and townspeople gathered around tables, their voices low but their worry evident. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, wiped glasses with shaking hands as he listened to the heated discussions. "I'm telling you it's them Apache," growled Bill Henderson, a neighboring rancher whose own herd had remained untouched. "They're getting bold again, thinking they can take what they want." "But there's no tracks, Bill," protested Sarah Miller, the town's schoolteacher, and one of the few voices of reason in the crowd. "How do you explain cattle disappearing without leaving any trace?" "Indians know how to cover their tracks," Bill replied, taking a long swig of his whiskey. "They've been doing it for centuries." Outside the saloon, unnoticed by the arguing crowd, a figure moved silently through the shadows cast by the setting sun. Aiyana, an Apache warrior of 28 years, pressed herself against the wooden wall of the building, listening intently to the conversations within. Her dark eyes reflected both intelligence and concern as she absorbed the growing hostility toward her people. Aiyana had been watching the Thornfield ranch for days, not out of any desire to steal cattle, but because she'd noticed something the white men had missed entirely. Her keen eyes, trained from childhood to read the subtle signs of the desert, had spotted anomalies that the Cowboys' search parties had trampled over without recognizing. She wore traditional Apache clothing, a long deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, moccasins that allowed her to move silently across any terrain, and her long black hair braided with small feathers and leather cords. Around her waist hung a knife and a small pouch containing various tools and medicines. Despite the growing tensions, she had come to the white settlement seeking a chance to prevent the conflict she saw brewing. As the voices inside the saloon grew more agitated, Aiyana made her decision. She had to find a way to speak with the cattle baron, to show him what his men had missed. But she knew that approaching a white man's ranch as an Apache woman would likely result in gunfire rather than conversation. The next morning, Marcus stood in his study, staring at a map of his property spread across his desk. Red marks indicated where cattle had disappeared, forming a pattern that made no sense to him. The losses weren't random. They seemed to follow a specific route, but one that led nowhere his men could find. A commotion outside drew his attention. Through his window, he saw his cowboys gathered in an excited circle near the barn. Marcus strode outside, his boots creating small dust clouds with each step. "What's all the noise about?" he demanded. Tom Bradley looked up from examining something on the ground. "Boss, you need to see this. We found something." Marcus pushed through the circle of men and looked down. There, pressed into a patch of soft earth near the water trough, was a single moccasin print. It was small, delicate, clearly made by a woman. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus breathed. "An Apache scout. A woman, no less." "She must have been checking out our defenses," Jake suggested, "planning the next raid." Marcus knelt beside the print, studying it carefully. Something about it struck him as odd. The print was clear, perfect, almost as if it had been left deliberately. A skilled Apache scout would never leave such an obvious trail unless they wanted to be found. "Boss," Tom said quietly, "there's something else. Look here." He pointed to a series of small stones arranged near the print. To the Cowboys they appeared random, but Marcus had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize that nothing was ever truly random when it came to Apache communications. "It's a message," Marcus realized, his voice barely above a whisper. "She left us a message." Before anyone could respond, a voice called out from behind them. "Mr. Thornfield, sir." A young cowboy named Pete came running from the direction of the north pasture, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "What is it, Pete?" "Sir, you need to come quick. We found one of the missing cattle. Just one, but it's alive." Marcus felt his heart leap. "Where? Show me." The group mounted their horses and followed Pete across the ranch toward a rocky outcropping that bordered Apache territory. As they rode, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that events were building toward something significant. The mysterious moccasin print, the arranged stones, and now a recovered steer. It was too much to be coincidence. They found the steer grazing peacefully in a small canyon, completely unharmed but bearing something unusual. Tied around its neck with a leather cord was a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. "Don't touch it," Marcus ordered, as one of his men reached for the package. It could be a trap, but even as he said the words, Marcus knew this wasn't a trap. It was another message. Carefully he dismounted and approached the steer, speaking softly to keep the animal calm. With steady hands, he untied the cord and unwrapped the deerskin bundle. Inside was something that made his blood run cold, a detailed drawing on birch bark, showing the exact layout of his ranch, with marks indicating where cattle had been taken. But more disturbing was what the drawing revealed. The cattle weren't being driven away from the ranch. According to this map, they were being driven deeper into his own property, toward an area his men had never properly searched. At the bottom of the drawing was another symbol, the same arrangement of stones they'd found by the water trough, but this time accompanied by a simple drawing of the sun at its highest point. "She wants to meet," Marcus said quietly, understanding flooding through him. "High noon, she wants to meet at the place marked on this map." Tom Bradley moved closer to examine the drawing. "Boss, that's near Devil's Backbone, that ridge of rocks about 5 miles east. It's rough country, lots of places for an ambush." Marcus studied the map again, his mind racing. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, that he could be walking into a trap. But another part of him, the part that had built his empire by taking calculated risks, whispered that this Apache woman might hold the key to solving his problem. "Sir," Jake said hesitantly, "you can't be thinking of going alone to meet some Apache warrior. It's suicide." Marcus folded the birch bark carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Maybe, but 30 of my best men haven't been able to solve this mystery in 3 weeks. Maybe it's time to try a different approach." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, moving inexorably toward its noon position, Marcus Thornfield faced the most important decision of his life: trust in an Apache warrior who claimed to have answers, or continue down a path that seemed destined to end in bloodshed and failure. The desert wind whistled through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of revelations that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about his land and his enemies. The sun hung directly overhead, like a merciless eye, as Marcus Thornfield rode alone toward Devil's Backbone, the jagged ridge of red rock that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Against the advice of his men, he had come without backup, carrying only his rifle and the weight of 3 weeks' worth of unanswered questions. The landscape around Devil's Backbone was harsh and unforgiving, a maze of wind-carved stone formations, deep arroyos, and scattered patches of hardy desert vegetation. It was the kind of place where a man could easily disappear forever, which made Marcus question his sanity for coming here alone. But something about the Apache woman's messages had convinced him that this was his only chance for answers. As he approached the designated meeting spot, a natural amphitheater carved into the rock face, Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the dry desert air. His horse's hooves clicked against the stone as they climbed the narrow path, each sound echoing off the canyon walls like gunshots. "That's far enough, Cattle Baron." The voice came from above, clear and strong. Marcus reined in his horse and looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the blazing sky. With practiced grace, the Apache woman descended the rock face, moving like water flowing downhill until she stood on a ledge about 20 feet away from him. Up close, Aiyana was not what Marcus had expected. Her face held the classical beauty of her people: high cheekbones, dark, intelligent eyes, and an expression of quiet dignity that commanded respect. She was younger than he'd anticipated, perhaps in her late 20s, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen much of life and survived it all. "You came alone," she observed, her English crisp and unaccented. "That shows either wisdom or foolishness. I haven't decided which." Marcus dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "You're the one who's been leaving me messages. You said you had answers about my missing cattle." "I do." Aiyana moved down to ground level with fluid grace, but maintained her distance. "But first, tell me why you think my people are responsible for your losses." The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected denials, negotiations, perhaps even threats. "Because cattle don't just vanish into thin air, and Apache have been raiding these lands for generations." "Have you seen any Apache taking your cattle?" she asked. "No, but have your men found any proof that Apache are involved?" Marcus hesitated. "No clear proof, but who else could move cattle without leaving tracks?" Aiyana's expression grew stern. "You assume because we are skilled at hiding our movements that we must be thieves. Your 30 cowboys have spent 3 weeks searching in the wrong places. asking the wrong questions, because they believe what you believe, that the threat must come from outside. Then where are my cattle? Marcus demanded, his frustration bleeding through. Without warning, Aiyana moved to a nearby boulder and climbed atop it, pointing toward a section of his ranch that appeared empty and unremarkable. Your cattle are there. All of them. Alive, well-fed, and completely hidden from your men because they don't know how to see what the land is trying to show them. Marcus squinted in the direction she indicated. That's impossible. My men have searched every inch of that area. Have they looked beneath it? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Beneath it? Aiyana jumped down from the boulder and approached him, stopping just outside arm's reach. Cattle Baron, you have built your empire on this land, but you don't truly know this land. Your people see the surface, but the Apache see the bones beneath. She gestured toward the area again. 50 years ago, flash floods carved a network of underground chambers and tunnels through that section. The entrances are hidden, camouflaged by rockfalls and desert growth. Your cattle aren't being stolen. They're being herded into these natural corrals and trapped there. Marcus felt his world shifting beneath his feet. That's impossible. Cattle can't just walk into caves. They can if someone drives them there. Someone who knows exactly how to funnel them through the hidden entrances. Aiyana's voice took on a hard edge. Someone who wants you to blame the Apache for the thefts while he sells your cattle in Mexico. Someone? Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. You know who's doing this? Wade Brennan. The name hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. Wade Brennan was his former foreman, a man he'd trusted for 5 years before firing him 6 months ago for drinking and mistreating the horses. Brennan had left in anger, swearing revenge against Marcus and the ranch. Brennan knows every inch of this property, Marcus said slowly, the pieces falling into place. He'd know about any caves or hidden areas. He's been using the underground chambers as a staging area, Aiyana continued. Drive your cattle in through one entrance, rest them, feed them, then move them out through another exit that leads directly to Mexico. By the time your men search the area, it appears empty because the cattle are either underground or already across the border. Marcus stared at the seemingly innocent stretch of desert, his mind reeling. Why are you telling me this? Why help me? Aiyana's expression softened slightly. Because your cowboys are about to ride into Apache territory looking for your stolen cattle. When they don't find them, your anger will grow. Eventually, you'll convince yourself that we're hiding the truth, and you'll attack our village. My people will defend themselves, your people will fight back, and innocent blood will be spilled on both sides. And you want to prevent that. I have seen enough war, Cattle Baron. My father and 2 brothers died fighting your soldiers. I don't want to see my remaining family die because of stolen cattle that were never stolen by Apache hands. Marcus felt a strange mixture of respect and shame wash over him. This Apache woman had risked her life to prevent a conflict that would have destroyed both their peoples, while he had been ready to lead his men into that very same battle based on nothing but assumptions and prejudice. How do I know you're telling the truth? He asked, though he already believed her. Aiyana smiled for the first time, transforming her serious face into something luminous. Because I'm going to show you, right now. Your friend Brennan is planning to move the latest group of cattle tonight. If we hurry, we can catch him in the act. She moved toward her own horse, a magnificent painted mare that had been hidden behind the rocks. But we must move quickly, and you must trust me completely. Can you do that, Marcus Thornfield? The use of his first name, spoken with such simple dignity, made his decision for him. Lead the way. As they mounted their horses and prepared to ride toward the hidden chambers, Marcus realized that in the space of a single conversation, everything had changed. His enemy had become his ally, his assumptions had been shattered, and his 30 cowboys' 3 weeks of failure were about to be resolved by one Apache warrior's 30 minutes of truth. The afternoon sun beat down on them as they rode toward a revelation that would prove the value of understanding over prejudice and show that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. The ride to the hidden underground chambers took Marcus and Aiyana across terrain he thought he knew like the back of his hand. But following the Apache woman's lead, he discovered pathways between rock formations he'd never noticed, natural corridors that seemed invisible until she pointed them out. Every few minutes, Aiyana would raise her hand, signaling him to stop while she examined signs that were completely meaningless to his untrained eyes. Fresh tracks, she whispered, dismounting to study hoofprints in a patch of sandy soil between 2 massive boulders. Brennan was here this morning, scouting the route. He'll move the cattle at sunset when your men return to the ranch house for supper. Marcus checked his pocket watch. They had less than 2 hours before sunset. How many cattle are we talking about? From what I observed, at least 60 head in the main chamber, maybe more in the smaller caves. Aiyana remounted her horse with fluid grace. He's been collecting them for weeks, waiting until he has enough to make the trip to Mexico worthwhile. As they continued riding, Marcus found himself studying Aiyana with growing admiration. She read the landscape like he might read a book, extracting information from the smallest details, the way grass bent, the pattern of disturbed pebbles, even the behavior of desert birds overhead. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to what appeared to be a solid rock wall ahead of them. "The main entrance." Marcus squinted, but saw nothing except weathered stone and scattered brush. "I don't see any entrance." Aiyana smiled and urged her horse forward. As they drew closer, Marcus began to make out what his eyes had missed before, a narrow gap between two massive boulders, cleverly concealed by fallen rocks and desert vegetation. The opening was just wide enough for cattle to pass through single file, but so well hidden that a person could ride past it a dozen times without noticing. "Brennan chose well," Marcus admitted grudgingly. "I've ridden through here countless times and never saw this." They dismounted and secured their horses behind a screen of mesquite bushes. Aiyana led the way to the hidden entrance, moving with the silent grace that seemed as natural to her as breathing. As they slipped through the narrow opening, Marcus was amazed to find himself in a vast underground chamber carved from the living rock by centuries of flash floods. The sight that greeted him made his breath catch in his throat. Dozens of cattle stood peacefully in the natural corral, munching on hay that had obviously been brought in for them. The chamber was enormous, easily large enough to hold 100 head of livestock, with multiple passages leading off into darkness. "My God," Marcus whispered. "It's perfect. No wonder my men couldn't find them." Aiyana pointed to fresh wheel tracks in the sandy floor. "Brennan brings in feed and water regularly. He's been treating this like his own private ranch, fattening your cattle before driving them south." The sound of approaching voices echoed from one of the side passages. Aiyana immediately pressed herself against the wall and motioned for Marcus to do the same. Within moments, Wade Brennan emerged from the shadows, accompanied by 3 men Marcus didn't recognize, rough-looking characters who were obviously hired guns rather than cowboys. "Tonight's the night, boys," Brennan was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "We move these cattle out after dark, and we'll be across the border by dawn. Thornfield will never figure out what happened, and we'll be rich men in Mexico." One of the hired men, a lanky fellow with a scraggly beard, spat into the sand. "What if his cowboys come looking again?" Brennan laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the chamber walls. "Those idiots couldn't find water in a rainstorm. They've been searching for weeks and haven't come close. By the time they figure out we've been right under their noses, we'll be long gone." Marcus felt his anger boiling over, but Aiyana's steady hand on his arm kept him in place. She leaned close to his ear and whispered so quietly he could barely hear her. "How fast can you get your men here?" 20 minutes if I ride hard," he whispered back. "Too long. He'll be moving the cattle in less than an hour, and once they're in those narrow passages, we'll never stop them." Aiyana studied the layout of the chamber, her mind clearly working through possibilities. "We need to stop them now, before they can start the drive. 4 against 2 aren't good odds," Marcus pointed out. Aiyana's eyes gleamed with determination. 4 against 2, yes. But they don't know we're here, and they don't know the chamber like I do." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Aiyana was moving. She slipped away into the shadows with such silence that even Marcus, watching her go, lost sight of her within seconds. He found himself alone, watching Brennan and his men prepare for the cattle drive that would complete their theft. Suddenly, a low rumbling sound echoed through the chamber. Brennan and his men looked around in confusion as the sound grew louder. Then, without warning, a section of the chamber wall that Marcus hadn't even noticed was movable swung open, and dozens of cattle began pouring out, clearly spooked and moving fast. "What the hell?" Brennan started to shout, but his words were lost in the thunderous noise of panicked livestock. Marcus realized what Aiyana had done. Somehow she had opened a passage that connected to another part of the underground network, one where she had previously hidden a second group of cattle. By releasing them all at once into the main chamber, she had created instant chaos. The hired gunmen scattered as frightened cattle charged in all directions. Brennan, caught off guard and separated from his men, found himself trapped against the chamber wall as a stream of longhorns thundered past him. This was Marcus's moment. He stepped out of hiding, his rifle trained on Brennan. "Hello, Wade. Fancy meeting you here." Brennan's face went white as he recognized his former boss. "Thornfield, how did you find my own cattle? Let's just say I had help from someone who actually knows this land." Marcus kept his rifle steady as the chaos of moving cattle began to settle. "Seems like you've been running quite an operation here." One of the hired gunmen tried to reach for his weapon, but found himself facing Aiyana, who had appeared behind him as silently as a shadow. The sharp edge of her knife pressed against his throat made him reconsider his options very quickly. Within 30 seconds of Aiyana opening that hidden passage, the entire situation had been resolved. Brennan and his men were captured, the cattle were secure, and Marcus's weeks-long mystery was solved. The solution that had eluded 30 experienced cowboys for 3 weeks had been accomplished by one Apache warrior in half a minute. "I don't understand," Brennan said, his voice shaking with defeat and confusion. "How did you know?" Marcus looked at Aiyana, who was efficiently securing the hired gunman with rope she'd brought from her saddlebags. "I learned something today, Wade. I learned that sometimes the people you think are your enemies are actually trying to help you, and sometimes the people you trust are the ones who'll steal you blind." As the dust settled in the underground chamber, Marcus realized that this moment would change everything, not just the recovery of his cattle, but his entire understanding of the land he thought he owned and the people he thought he knew. The setting sun, filtering through the hidden entrance, cast long shadows across a scene that proved wisdom could triumph over prejudice, and that the right knowledge, applied at the right moment, could solve problems that brute force and numbers never could. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the underground chambers, and the Thornfield ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. Word of Wade Brennan's arrest and the recovery of the stolen cattle had spread throughout Copper Ridge. But what surprised the townspeople even more was the story of how the mystery had been solved. Marcus stood on his porch in the early morning light, watching as his cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures where they belonged. The sight filled him with satisfaction, but it was tempered by a deeper understanding of how close he had come to making a terrible mistake. If not for Aiyana's intervention, he might have led his men into Apache territory, sparking a conflict that would have cost lives on both sides. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention. Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison rode into the yard, their faces bearing expressions of barely contained curiosity. Behind them rode a figure that had become a familiar sight around the ranch, Aiyana, mounted on her painted mare, her presence no longer causing the stir it had initially created among the cowboys. "Morning, boss," Tom called out as he dismounted. "Aiyana's found something you need to see." Marcus descended the porch steps, noting how naturally his foreman now spoke the Apache woman's name. The transformation in his men's attitudes had been gradual but unmistakable. After witnessing her skill in solving the cattle mystery, even the most prejudiced among them had begun to show grudging respect. "What is it?" Marcus asked. Aiyana slid gracefully from her horse, her expression serious but not alarmed. "More caves." Brennan wasn't the only one who knew about the underground network. "There are chambers we haven't explored, some of them large enough to hide entire herds." "Are you saying there might be more stolen cattle down there?" "Possibly, but more importantly, these chambers could be useful to you. Natural storage for feed during harsh winters, shelter for cattle during storms, even a source of fresh water during droughts." Aiyana's dark eyes met his steadily. "The land holds many secrets, Marcus Thornfield. Brennan knew some of them, but he used that knowledge to steal. You could use it to build." Tom Bradley scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. "Boss, she's right. We've had years where winter storms killed dozens of head because we couldn't get them to proper shelter fast enough. If we had natural caves—" "Show me," Marcus said simply. The ride to the new chambers took them deeper into the desert than Marcus had ever ventured. As they traveled, Aiyana pointed out features of the landscape that told stories he was only beginning to learn to read. Ancient flood patterns, seasonal water sources, migration routes used by wildlife for generations. "Your cowboys are skilled men," she said, as they paused to rest the horses in the shade of a towering rock formation. "But they were trained to work cattle on open range. This land requires different knowledge, older knowledge." Marcus found himself studying her profile as she gazed across the desert. "Knowledge your people have preserved for centuries. Yes, knowledge we would be willing to share if there were trust between our peoples." The implications of her words weren't lost on him. "You're talking about more than just finding caves, aren't you?" Aiyana turned to face him fully. "I'm talking about understanding. For too long your people and mine have seen each other as enemies, competing for the same resources. But this land is vast enough for all of us if we learn to work with it instead of fighting against it. They spent the remainder of the day exploring the newly discovered chambers. What they found exceeded even Aiyana's expectations. A vast network of interconnected caverns, some with natural pools of fresh water, others with openings that created perfect natural ventilation. It was like discovering a hidden infrastructure that had been waiting beneath his ranch all along. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the group made their way back toward the ranch. Marcus rode in contemplative silence, his mind processing everything he had learned over the past 2 weeks. "Aiyana," he said as they neared the ranch buildings, "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You saved my cattle, prevented a war, and opened my eyes to possibilities I never imagined." She smiled, that same luminous expression that had struck him during their first meeting. "You owe me nothing, Marcus Thornfield, but if you truly want to show gratitude, there is something you could do. Name it." There are others in town who still believe the Apache are a threat. Sheriff Carson, Mayor Williams, some of the other ranchers. When they spread fear about my people, perhaps you could share what you've learned. Help them understand that we are not enemies. Marcus nodded slowly. "I can do that. In fact, I think it's time Copper Ridge heard the whole story." That evening, an unprecedented gathering took place in the town's meeting hall. Marcus had sent word throughout Copper Ridge that he wanted to address the community about the recent cattle thefts. What the townspeople didn't expect was to see Aiyana standing beside him as he began to speak. "Folks, I've asked you here tonight to tell you about the greatest lesson I've learned in 52 years of life," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I've learned that sometimes our greatest allies are found among those we mistakenly consider our enemies." He told them the complete story. Wade Brennan's betrayal, the ingenious theft operation, and how Aiyana's knowledge had solved in moments what 30 men couldn't accomplish in weeks. He spoke of the vast underground network that could benefit the entire region, and of the Apache wisdom that could teach them all to work more harmoniously with the harsh but generous land they shared. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Aiyana, "saved not just my cattle but potentially dozens of lives that would have been lost in a pointless conflict. She did this not for reward, but because she believed peace was better than war." When he finished speaking, the hall was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, Sheriff Carson stood up. "Miss Aiyana," he said formally, "I believe I owe you an apology. We all do." One by one, other townspeople rose to their feet, adding their voices to the sheriff's. It wasn't a complete transformation. Marcus could see that some faces remained skeptical, some minds unchanged. But it was a beginning, and sometimes beginnings were the most important part of any journey. Later that night, as Aiyana prepared to return to her village, Marcus walked with her to where her horse waited. "Will I see you again?" he asked. "The land is large, but not so large that friends cannot find each other," she replied with a gentle smile. "Besides, you still have much to learn about those caves." As she rode away into the starlit desert, Marcus reflected on how completely his world had changed. 30 cowboys had failed to solve his problem because they were looking for the wrong answers in the wrong places. One Apache warrior had succeeded because she understood both the land and the value of peace over conflict. Standing beneath the vast canopy of stars, Marcus Thornfield realized that the greatest treasure he had gained wasn't the recovery of his stolen cattle. It was the discovery that wisdom, understanding, and cooperation could triumph over prejudice, fear, and ignorance. In a territory where conflicts between cultures had raged for generations, one woman's courage and one man's willingness to listen had proven that a different path was possible. The lesson would echo through Copper Ridge for years to come. Sometimes the solution to our greatest problems comes not from force or numbers, but from the wisdom to see beyond our assumptions and the courage to trust in the most unexpected allies.